Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today we're talking about that time when the most powerful man in Central Europe died from eating a dodgy mushroom, and the entire continent decided this was the perfect excuse to start an 8-year-long globe-spanning bar fight. Think of it as the world's worst group project, where everyone betrays everyone else, the instructions are on fire, and the prize is a mountain of debt and a slightly rearranged map. This is the story of how one legal document, the geopolitical equivalent of an "I promise not to steal your stuff" note, led to nearly a decade of glorious, powdered wig chaos. We're oversimplifying, of course. That's what we do here. You want nuance? Go read a textbook, you nerd, before the inevitable betrayal starts. If you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. The year is 1740. Europe is simmering. It's not quite boiling, but it's definitely making that little sound right before the water goes crazy. The vibe is tense. The continent is a patchwork of ancient dynasties, new money kingdoms, and fading empires, all held together by a web of treaties so tangled it would make a spider weep. In the heart of all this sits the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire famously pointed out, was not holy, not Roman, and barely an empire. It was more like a 1,000-year-old homeowners association with delusions of grandeur. And its undisputed top dog, its head honcho, its imperial big cheese, was the Habsburg dynasty. Rulers of Austria. The man in charge is Emperor Charles VI. And Chuck has a problem. A big, air-shaped problem. For his entire reign, he's been haunted by the fact that he has failed to produce a male heir. He has the wonderful daughters, but this is the 18th century. And the political establishment viewed female succession the same way we view pineapple on pizza. A deeply unnatural and offensive idea too many yet vigorously defended by a few. Without a son, the entire Habsburg dominion is sprawling. Chaotic collection of territories including Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, chunks of Italy, and the Netherlands could fracture upon his death. Cousins and rivals would pop out of the woodwork, waving around obscure family trees and demanding their piece of the pie. So, what does a worried emperor do? Does he build an unbeatable army to defend his legacy? Does he fill his treasury with gold to buy loyalty? No, that's for simpletons. Charles VI decides to solve his problem with paperwork. Glorious, world-changing paperwork. He spends the better part of the decades drafting, promoting, and begging people to sign a single document. It's called the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. That sounds fancy, but all it really said was, hey guys, when I die, all my stuff goes to my eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, and you all have to promise not to jump her. Okay, cool. This piece of paper became his life's work. His entire foreign policy was built around getting every major power in Europe to sign on the dotted line. It was the most expensive signature-gathering campaign in history. Need a port in the Adriatic? Sure, Britain, you can have trade concessions. Thinking about claiming some of my Italian land? Okay, Spain, here are a couple of duchies to keep you happy. Oh, France, my eternal rival, you want Lorraine? Fine, take it. Just sign the damn paper. He basically mortgaged Austria's future to secure its future. He toured the courts of Europe like a desperate salesman, holding up the Pragmatic Sanction and promising untold wonders if they'd just give him their autograph. And one by one, they did. Prussia, Britain, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, Russia, they all signed. They all solemnly swore an oath to respect Maria Theresa's inheritance. It was a beautiful, continent-wide pinky swear. Now, here's our first rapid-fire chain of terrible decisions. Cause, Charles VI becomes obsessed with legal guarantees, believing that a treaty signed by a king is an unbreakable bond of honor. He pours all of Austria's diplomatic energy and cash into securing these signatures. Effect, in the process, he neglects the one thing that actually enforces treaties, a modern, well-funded army. The Austrian military, once a continental terror, grew rusty. Its generals got old. Its coffers went empty paying for all this diplomatic glad-handing. Consequence, Charles dies leaving his daughter a crown, theoretically guaranteed by every king in Europe. But with a weak army and an empty bank account to actually defend it against them, he'd built a beautiful, legally airtight house, but forgot to install locks on the doors. You have to admire the optimism. Charles genuinely thought that in a room full of sharks, waving around a piece of paper that says no biting would actually work. It is the 18th century equivalent of putting a "please do not steal" sign on a bike with no lock in the middle of a city. It's a lovely sentiment, but it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of bicycles and thieves. Or, in this case, kings and empires. He had secured a promise, but he hadn't secured the power to enforce it. On the night of October 20th, 1740, the grand diplomatic experiment came to a sudden, undignified end. Emperor Charles VI, after a lovely day of hunting, sat down for dinner and ate a large dish of death cat mushrooms. The emperor, ruler of one of the world's great powers, died of food poisoning. The news spread like wildfire. In every capital, from Madrid to St. Petersburg, rulers received the message, the emperor is dead. And in every one of those capitals, they quietly slid open a drawer, pulled out their signed copy of the Pragmatic Sanction, and checked the fine print for loopholes. The ink wasn't even dry, metaphorically speaking, and already it was being treated less like a sacred vow and more like a suggestion. Suddenly, a 23-year-old woman named Maria Theresa was in charge. She was now Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, and a dozen other things. She was intelligent, proud, and completely unprepared. Her father, in his infinite wisdom, had secured her right to rule but had never actually taught her how to rule. She'd never been allowed in council meetings. She knew next to nothing about military strategy or state finances. She was also several months pregnant with her fourth child. Her advisors were a collection of ancient relics her father had left behind, men who believed caution was the only virtue. The vultures began to circle immediately. In Bavaria, the Elector Charles Albert suddenly remembered that his wife was a Habsburg, and through some creative genealogy, he argued that he had the better claim. The Spanish Bourbons started making similar noises about their claims in Italy. The French, who hated the Habsburgs with a passion usually reserved for bad wine, smiled sweetly and started mobilizing troops on the border, just in case. They had all signed the paper, every single one of them. But a promise is only as strong as the army standing behind it. And everyone knew Austria's army was a shadow of its former self. Europe held its breath. Who would be the first to break their word? Who would be the first to test the resolve of the young, untested queen? The answer would come from the north. From a kingdom that was less a country with an army and more an army with a country. The great European powers held their breath, waiting to see who would make the first move. The smart money was on France or Bavaria. Nobody was looking at the kingdom to the north. Nobody was looking at Prussia. At least, not yet. Prussia, at this point, wasn't really considered a heavyweight. It was a scrappy, bizarre kingdom on the Baltic coast, a patchwork of territories held together by sheer military willpower. It was famously described not as a state with an army, but an army with a state. And the man responsible for forging this weapon was the recently deceased King Frederick William I. Frederick William was, to put it mildly, an absolute terror. He was a penny-pinching, God-fearing, military-obsessed tyrant who ran Prussia like a boot camp. He despised anything he considered frivolous, which included art, philosophy, music, and basic human kindness. His one true love was the army. He poured every single thaler the state earned into making his military the most disciplined, most drilled, and most terrifying fighting force in Europe. He was also obsessed with tall soldiers. He created a special regiment, the Potsdam Giants, and sent agents across Europe to recruit, bribe, and even kidnap men over 6 feet tall to serve in it. He'd reportedly pay more for a 7-foot farmer than for a new ambassador. This was the man who built modern Prussia, brutal, efficient, and deeply weird. And he had a son who was everything he was not. The young Crown Prince Frederick was a sensitive, intelligent boy who loved to play the flute, write French poetry, and read forbidden philosophy under his covers at night. He started a secret correspondence with the great Enlightenment thinker Voltaire, discussing justice, reason, and the duties of a monarch. While his father was busy inspecting bayonets, young Frederick was dreaming of being a philosopher king, a ruler who would lead his people with wisdom and peace. Naturally, his father hated him for it. The relationship between Frederick and Frederick William was a special kind of hell. The king saw his son as a weak, effeminate disappointment and subjected him 2 years of relentless abuse, both public and private. He would beat him with his cane, humiliate him in front of the court, and burn his books. The horror reached its peak when Frederick, at age 18, tried to flee to England with his close friend, a young officer named Hans Hermann von Katt. They were caught. The king, in a fit of rage, had Katt court-martialed and sentenced to death. Then, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, he forced his son to watch from his prison cell window as his best friend was beheaded in the courtyard below. That is the moment the sensitive flute player died, and something much harder and more cynical was born. Frederick learned a vital lesson that day. Power, absolute and ruthless, was the only thing that mattered. In May of 1740, just 5 months before the mushroom incident, old Frederick William finally died. His last words were reportedly, "I am tired, no kidding." The intellectuals and diplomats of Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief. The madman of Prussia was gone, and his place was the charming, enlightened Prince Frederick. They expected an era of high culture and low military spending. They expected sonatas and salons. They were about to get cannons and conquests. The new king. Now Frederick II spent his first few months on the throne abolishing torture, promoting religious tolerance, and talking a big game about being a servant of the state. It was a brilliant PR campaign. Everyone thought Prussia had been declawed. Here is the perfect storm. The next chain of events that lights the fuse on the continental powder keg. Cause Frederick II inherits the magnificent, dangerous gifts from the father he despised. The first is a war chest containing over 8 million thalers, a staggering sum accumulated through his father's pathological cheapness. The second is an army of 80,000 men, drilled to robotic perfection and ready to march at a moment's notice. It was the 4th largest army in Europe, belonging to a state with the 13th largest population. Effect, he has the motive, the means, and the opportunity. The motive is a deep, burning ambition to make his mark, to elevate Prussia to the top table of European powers, and prove he was more than just his father's abused son. The means are the army and the cash. The opportunity is the death of Charles VI. Consequence, the philosopher king persona is revealed to be a costume. The moment a real-world chance for glory appears, all the talk of justice and reason is shoved into a drawer. Power politics, raw and simple, takes over. All those fancy letters to Voltaire about the virtues of a just ruler, all that sensitive flute playing in a powdered wig, it was all just a hobby. It was what he did in his downtime. Deep down, Frederick had learned his father's most important lesson. Philosophy is nice, but a bayonet is a better argument. Europe was about to learn that the philosopher king was, first and foremost, a king, and kings take things. He saw the chaos in Vienna as a divine invitation. A young, inexperienced woman on the throne, an army in disarray, a treasury that was basically just moths and iOS. It was too good to be true. Frederick gathered his ministers. He laid out his plan, not to help the beleaguered Maria Theresa, as his signature on the pragmatic sanction demanded, not to act as a neutral arbiter. His plan was to invade, to march his father's perfect army straight into Austrian territory and seize their richest province. His chief minister, a wise old man named Podwils, was horrified. He stammered something about treaties, about the sacred promise Prussia had made. He warned of the danger of provoking a continent-wide war. He asked the young king to consider his reputation, his honor. Frederick's response was cold, clear, and a perfect summary of 18th century geopolitics. He acknowledged the legal and moral issues were, let's say, problematic. But then he weighed them against the potential reward. He saw the prospect of acquiring a reputation and expanding the power of his house. The army was ready. The treasury was full. His rivals were unprepared. The moment was now. As for the legal justification, he'd have his lawyers cook something up later. The decision was made. Prussia was going to war. His target, the rich, populous, and strategically vital Austrian province of Silesia. It was time for the smash and grab. So, Frederick the Great, the supposed champion of enlightened reason, had decided to start a war. But why Silesia? Of all the chunks of the sprawling Habsburg Empire, why this one? The answer is simple. Silesia was the jackpot. It was the 18th century equivalent of finding an unlocked vault full of cash, gold, and a winning lottery ticket. It wasn't just some sleepy backwater province. It was the industrial and financial engine of the Austrian monarchy. Let's put this in perspective. This single province, nestled along the Oder River, generated a full quarter of the Habsburgs' entire tax revenue. A quarter. Its textile industry was booming, weaving linen that was sold all across Europe. Below the ground, it was packed with iron, zinc, and coal, the raw materials for any future military-industrial complex. Strategically, it was a dagger pointed at the heart of both Prussia and Austria. For Austria, it acted as a massive natural fortress protecting their core territory of Bohemia. For Prussia, it was a constant threat looming over their capital, Berlin, which was less than 100 miles away. Frederick saw that by taking Silesia, he would achieve 3 things at once. First, he'd get rich. Insanely rich. The tax revenue alone would allow him to expand his already ridiculous army. Second, he'd make his arch-rival, Austria, significantly poorer and weaker. It was a classic 2-for-1 deal. Third, he'd transform Prussia's strategic position from vulnerable to dominant. He'd kick Austria out of its forward operating base and turn it into his own, as an added bonus. A large portion of Silesia's population was Protestant, and Frederick cynically calculated they would rather be ruled by a fellow Protestant, even an invader, than their Catholic Habsburg overlords. It was the perfect prize. All he needed was an excuse, a legal justification. His lawyers, presumably sweating under their powdered wigs, frantically dug through centuries of Hohenzollern family history. What they came back with was creative. To call their legal reasoning thin would be an insult to thin things. It was transparent. It was a ghost of an argument. Their primary claim rested on a dusty, 300-year-old inheritance treaty from 1537. Some obscure Silesian duke had made a deal with the Hohenzollerns that if either of their family lines died out, the other would inherit their lands. There were just a few tiny problems with this claim. First, the Habsburg emperor at the time, Ferdinand I, had immediately declared the treaty null and void. Second, the Hohenzollerns themselves had formally renounced the claim about 100 years later in exchange for other considerations. It was, legally speaking, absolute garbage. It was like trying to claim your neighbor's house because your great-great-great-grand-uncle once shook hands with his great-great-great-grand-uncle at a barn raising. The lawyers also found some other, even more ridiculous claims based on which princess married which duke in the 1400s. It didn't matter. Frederick didn't need a case that would hold up in court. He just needed a sentence he could write on a banner. This leads us to the next link in the disaster chain. Cause Frederick knows perfectly well that his legal pretext for war is a joke. He understands that sending a diplomat to Vienna to debate 16th century inheritance law will get him laughed out of the room. Effect, he decides to completely invert the established diplomatic process. The time-honored tradition was to make demands, negotiate, issue an ultimatum, and then, if all else failed, declare war. Frederick's plan was to declare war first by launching a surprise invasion, and then see if anyone wanted to negotiate. Consequence, he throws the entire European diplomatic system into chaos. He presents Maria Theresa not with a problem to be solved, but with a crisis already in progress. By seizing Silesia before she could even mobilize her army, he would be negotiating from a position of overwhelming strength, forcing her to accept his theft as a done deal. This is one of history's great ask for forgiveness, not permission moments. Just with 80,000 soldiers, Frederick's logic was gangster-level simple. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and the other 10th is having a better army than the person who owns the thing you just stole. All the powdered dash with diplomacy in the world can't argue with a line of grenadiers standing on your front lawn. He was betting that the sheer shock and speed of his attack would paralyze Austria before it could respond effectively. While his lawyers were busy stapling fig leaves together, the Prussian war machine, the pride and joy of his terrifying father, began to mobilize in terrifying silence. Regiments were brought up to full strength, cannons were hitched to horses, mountains of grain and gunpowder were stockpiled near the border, and it was all done with incredible speed and secrecy. To the outside world, King Frederick II was still the picture of enlightened civility. He was attending operas in Berlin. He was writing letters to Voltaire complaining about the headaches of statecraft. He was playing his flute. It was the ultimate deception. He lulled Europe into a false sense of security, projecting an image of peace while sharpening the sword in the dark. Only when his armies were massed on the Silesian border, ready to pour across at a moment's notice, did he finally dispatch an envoy to Vienna. But this envoy wasn't carrying a list of grievances or a request for talks. He was carrying an ultimatum wrapped in a threat, disguised as an offer of friendship. The message was breathtaking in its arrogance. Frederick offered Maria Theresa his assistance in the coming political storm. He would use his influence to get her husband, Francis Stephen, elected as the next Holy Roman Emperor. He would defend her against any other vultures who might attack. He even offered a cash subsidy. In return for this generous protection, all she had to do was cede the entirety of Silesia to him. It was the proposal of a mob boss, not a monarch. Nice empire you've got there, he was saying. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. The smash and grab was on. On December 16, 1740, the talking stopped. Well, for Frederick, it had never really started. Without a formal declaration of war, without any of the diplomatic pageantry that usually preceded 18th century conflicts, the Prussian army crossed the border. An iron gray tide of 27,000 perfectly drilled soldiers poured into Silesia. At their head was the 28-year-old king himself, a philosopher-poet leading one of the most brutal military machines on the planet. The invasion had begun, and Europe's most expensive pinky swear was officially broken. The initial campaign wasn't a campaign at all. It was an armed procession, the Austrian presence in Silesia was laughably small. There were maybe 7,000 Habsburg troops scattered across the entire province. Garrisoned in a few old fortresses, they were isolated, unprepared, and had no idea they were even at war, until a column of Prussian grenadiers appeared on the horizon. Most Silesian towns, faced with overwhelming force and a king promising to respect their rights as long as they paid their taxes to him, simply opened their gates. Frederick's propaganda machine was working overtime, plastering up proclamations declaring that he came not as a conqueror, but as a friend, here to protect Silesia from, well, he never really specified from what. The Prussian army moved with a speed and efficiency that stunned contemporary observers. This wasn't the usual sluggish, baggage train heavy crawl of other European armies. This was the machine his father had built. And it was working perfectly. Each regiment knew its route, its objective, and its timetable. By the first week of January 1741, less than a month after crossing the border, they stood before the gates of Breslau, the provincial capital, the city, intimidated and seeing no hope of relief. From Vienna, capitulated, Frederick had captured the heart of Silesia without fighting a single major battle. He rode into the city in triumph, the conqueror of a province he had, on paper, no right to even be in. The sheer velocity of the invasion created its own strategic reality. Let's trace this next causal chain of pure, uncut audacity. Cause: Frederick's invasion is launched with total surprise and unprecedented speed, deliberately violating all the gentlemanly rules of 18th century warfare. He doesn't declare war, he just shows up. Effect: the Austrian government in Vienna is thrown into a state of total paralysis. News of the Prussian army occupying Silesian towns arrived at the Hofburg Palace at almost the exact same moment as Frederick's envoy, who was delivering the condescending offer of protection in exchange for the province. They were being robbed and handed the robbers' business cards simultaneously. There was no time to organize a defense. Consequence: Frederick achieves his primary objective before his enemy can even respond. He now controls the territory. The argument is no longer about his flimsy legal claims. It's about the hard reality of 27,000 Prussian soldiers collecting Silesian taxes. He has successfully flipped the board, forcing Maria Theresa to fight a war to reclaim her own land. You have to understand how utterly shocking this was. In the 18th century, wars were supposed to have an opening ceremony. You sent a sternly worded letter. Your ambassador packed his bags, and then, after a respectable interval, you started shooting. Frederick just skipped to the shooting. It was the geopolitical equivalent of punching someone in the face mid-handshake. It wasn't just an act of aggression, it was rude. It was a violation of the unwritten code of conduct that kept the powdered wig world from descending into absolute chaos. And it sent a clear, terrifying message to the rest of Europe. The old rules were officially optional now. The news of the Silesian invasion exploded across the continent's courts. In London, they were aghast at the violation of a treaty. In the Dutch Republic, they were worried about the balance of power. But in Paris, the mood was entirely different. At the court of King Louis XV, there was quiet, malicious glee. The French Foreign Ministry saw Frederick not as a dangerous rogue, but as a useful tool. Here was this upstart Prussian king doing their dirty work for them. He was single-handedly tearing down their ancient rival, the House of Habsburg. France had also signed the Pragmatic Sanction. Of course, but that was just a piece of paper. This was an opportunity. Frederick's invasion wasn't a crime, it was an invitation. It was the starting gun that signaled the beginning of the Great Habsburg Buffet. If the Prussians were getting a slice, why shouldn't everyone else? Back in Vienna, the full scale of the disaster was becoming clear. Maria Theresa was in an impossible position. Her ministers, a council of geriatrics who still thought the Ottoman Empire was the main threat, were panicked and useless. They urged caution, negotiation, even appeasement. They advised her to consider Frederick's offer, to cut her losses and give up Silesia to save the rest of her inheritance. The treasury was empty. The army was a mess. Winter was setting in. Every piece of logical advice pointed toward surrender. Every one of her father's old advisors told her the fight was already lost. The young queen, surrounded by defeatism and betrayal, now had to make a choice. Would she be the timid victim everyone expected her to be, or would she fight? The fate of her empire, and the next 8 years of European history, hung on her answer. Back in the grand, drafty halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the mood was pure panic. Maria Theresa's council was a museum of old-world diplomacy. These were her father's men, ancient, cautious aristocrats like Count Zinzendorf, who had spent their lives making careful deals in smoke-filled back rooms. They looked at the situation with what they thought was cold, hard realism. The treasury contained nothing but dust and ios. The army was a scattered, disorganized mess. Frederick's military machine was already sitting on their prize. To them, the conclusion was obvious and painful. They gathered around the young queen, their faces long and grim, and urged her to cut her losses. Accept the offer, they pleaded. Give him Silesia. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but it will save the rest. If we fight, we lose everything. France will attack from the west, Bavaria will attack from the north, Spain will carve up Italy. This is the only sane move. They laid out maps, quoted troop numbers, and explained the financial impossibility of a full-scale war. Every single one of them, these seasoned statesmen who had served her father for decades, told her to surrender the province. They saw a lost cause, and their only goal was damage control. They saw a frightened young woman who needed their wise, fatherly guidance to navigate her first crisis. They did not know their queen. Maria Theresa listened to their litany of despair, her expression hardening with every word. When they were finished, the 23-year-old ruler, whom Frederick had dismissed as a weak girl, did not weep or waver. She exploded. She was filled with a righteous, incandescent fury that shocked the old men into silence. She saw this not as a simple land dispute, but as a fundamental attack on her honor, her dynasty, and her God-given right to rule. She understood, with a clarity that eluded her wise advisors, that caving to a bully only teaches them that bullying works. If she sacrificed Silesia today, she'd be asked for Bohemia tomorrow and Austria the day after. This was her defining moment. She flatly rejected the advice of her entire council. There would be no deal. There would be no negotiation. Not 1 inch of Habsburg land would be ceded. She declared she would rather the Turks be at the gates of Vienna, the ultimate nightmare scenario for any Habsburg ruler, than give up Silesia. She denounced the King of Prussia not as a rival monarch, but as that evil man, a treacherous goblin who had broken a sacred oath. She sent Frederick's envoy, a man named Goddard, packing with a message that was the 18th century equivalent of tell your boss to go jump in a lake. The war was on. It was her decision, made alone, against the counsel of every experienced man in the room. Her defiance ignited a firestorm. Cause Maria Theresa, driven by a powerful sense of dynastic pride and personal honor, makes the seemingly irrational decision to fight a war everyone tells her she is guaranteed to lose. Effect: her iron will shatters the defeatist atmosphere in Vienna. It transforms her public image overnight from a vulnerable heiress into a formidable warrior queen, a mother defending her children. Her resolution also completely blindsides Frederick, who had genuinely calculated that a weak, illogical woman would surely see reason and trade land for peace. Consequence: the conflict is now locked in. There is no off-ramp, no easy diplomatic solution. By refusing to concede, Maria Theresa forces the issue. This won't be a quick, surgical operation. It's going to be a long, bloody, knockdown, drag-out fight that will inevitably suck in every other major power on the continent. She didn't just reject Frederick's terms, she rejected his entire worldview. This is the moment the script gets flipped. Frederick thought he was playing chess against a novice, expecting a quick checkmate in 3 moves. Instead, Maria Theresa kicks over the table, lights the board on fire, and swears a blood oath to hunt him down. All the cold, cynical calculations made in Berlin were met with pure, unadulterated Habsburg fury from Vienna. This wasn't just about a province anymore, it was personal. She was fighting not just for territory, but for the very principle that treaties mattered and that a woman's inheritance was as valid as a man's. Of course, righteous anger doesn't win battles. Now she had to back it up. The frantic scramble began. Orders flew out from Vienna to every corner of the sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. Any available regiment was to march north. The man tasked with this impossible mission was Field Marshal Wilhelm von Neipperg. He was a competent, if uninspired, veteran commander. His job was to assemble a functional army out of thin air, march it through the dead of winter across the mountains separating Moravia from Silesia, and somehow surprise and defeat the greatest army in Europe. The force Neipperg gathered was a sorry sight. It was under-equipped. Its soldiers were poorly trained compared to the Prussian Ottomans, and its supply lines were a disaster waiting to happen. But it was an army. It was the physical manifestation of Maria Theresa's will. As they began their slow, arduous trek north in the early spring of 1741, Frederick, who had settled into comfortable winter quarters in Silesia, was about to get the surprise of his life. He had wanted a province, and he had assumed he could get it with a bill of sale and a threat. Now, thanks to the unshakable resolve of the young queen, he was about to get a real war. The first major collision was just weeks away. As the snows of early 1741 began to melt, the Austrian army under Field Marshal Neipperg did something remarkable. it moved. And it moved with a purpose and speed. That caught the overconfident Prussians completely by surprise. Frederick had settled his army into comfortable winter quarters across Silesia, assuming the fighting was over until spring. He figured the Austrians were too broke and disorganized to mount a winter campaign. He was wrong. Nieperg, leading his patched-together force, cleverly slipped past the main Prussian detachments and drove deep into Silesia. His objective clear: to relieve the besieged fortress of Nice and cut Frederick off from his direct route back to Prussia. Suddenly, the board was flipped. The predator had become the prey. Panic erupted in the Prussian headquarters. Frederick, the brilliant aggressor, had been tactically outfoxed by a general he considered a plotting mediocrity. Now it was the Prussians who were scrambling, force marching their regiments across muddy roads in a desperate attempt to unite their scattered forces and confront the Austrians. Before their entire campaign unraveled, the perfect, elegant invasion had devolved into a frantic, clumsy chase. On April 10th, near the small Silesian village of Malwitz, the two armies finally collided. It was a bleak, snowy day, the perfect backdrop for the first major bloodletting of the war. This was the moment of truth for Frederick and his father's army, and initially, it was a complete and utter catastrophe. The battle began with a cavalry charge. The Austrian horsemen, under the command of the brilliant General Reimer, were battle-hardened veterans. The Prussian cavalry, despite their fancy uniforms and arrogant reputation, were untested. The Austrians slammed into the Prussian right flank like a battering ram. And the Prussian line didn't just bend, it vaporized. The Prussian horsemen were swept from the field in a humiliating rout. Austrian cavalry swarmed through the breach, crashing into the flank of the Prussian infantry and overrunning their artillery batteries. Chaos reigned. The battle seemed lost within the first hour. From his command post, King Frederick II saw his elite cavalry shattered, Austrian hussars rampaging behind his lines, and his army on the verge of collapse. He panicked. His cool, philosophical demeanor evaporated, replaced by the raw terror of a young man who was in way over his head. His veteran general, Field Marshal Schwerin, saw it too. Fearing the king would be killed, or even worse, captured an unthinkable disgrace. Schwerin practically threw Frederick onto a horse and yelled at him to save himself. And Frederick ran. The great conqueror, the man who had gambled everything on this war, turned tail and fled the battlefield. It was an ignominious, comical flight. He rode for hours, believing his army was being annihilated behind him. He even tried to take refuge in a nearby town, only to be told it was occupied by Austrian patrols, forcing him to gallop off into the dark. But back at Malwitz, something incredible was happening. The Prussian cavalry and its royal commander suffer a catastrophic failure of nerve, leading to a near-total collapse of the army's flank and command structure. Effect: the responsibility for the entire battle falls upon the Prussian infantry, the one part of the army that was not led by dashing aristocrats, but was instead a soulless, perfectly engineered machine created by the late Frederick William I. Consequence: while their king is galloping away in terror, the infantry, under Schwerin's stoic command, performs exactly as it was designed to. They become a wall of iron and fire. They win a battle their king had already abandoned. So get this, the great military genius Frederick the Great's first ever battle was such a disaster that he ran away before it was over. He was probably halfway back to Berlin, composing a sad poem on his flute, when he got the news that the zombie robot army his dad built had won the battle without him. It's the ultimate group project victory, where one quiet guy does all the work while the team leader is having a panic attack in the bathroom. Humiliating for Frederick, but a terrifying lesson for Europe. The Prussian infantry saved the day through sheer brute force repetition. They had been drilled relentlessly in one thing: loading and firing their muskets faster than anyone else. Using their famous iron ramrods, they could fire 4 or 5 volleys in the time an Austrian soldier could fire 2. They stood in their rigid lines as Austrian cavalry charged them, waited until they saw the whites of their eyes, and unleashed a perfectly synchronized volley that ripped the enemy formations to shreds. They repelled charge after charge. Then they began to advance, a slow, methodical, unstoppable wall of lead and steel. The Austrian infantry couldn't stand up to this mechanical slaughter. Their lines buckled, then broke. By nightfall, it was Nieperg's army that was in full retreat. Frederick sheepishly returned to find the field held and his army victorious. The shame of his flight burned into him, but the victory, however ugly, was decisive. It proved two things to the watching world. First, the Prussian king was a coward who had been bailed out by his troops. Second, and far more importantly, the Prussian infantry was an invincible killing machine. The accidental victory at Malwitz sent a shockwave across Europe. and it was about to convince a whole new set of players that it was finally time to place their bets. The news of the Battle of Malwitz echoed through the courts of Europe like a starting pistol. The battle itself was a messy, embarrassing affair for the Prussian command. But that's not how the diplomats and generals of other nations saw it. They ignored Frederick's panicked flight and focused on the stunning, terrifying conclusion: the Austrian army, the inheritor of a long and proud military tradition, had been broken and forced to retreat by the Prussian infantry. The myth of Habsburg invincibility was shattered. Austria was vulnerable. The dinner bell had been rung. No, where did that bell ring louder than in Paris? For over 2 centuries, French foreign policy had been guided by a single, beautifully simple principle: anything that was bad for the Habsburgs was good for France. The two houses, Bourbon and Habsburg, were locked in a generational struggle for mastery of the continent. The French court, under the aging King Louis XV, was split. The cautious chief minister, the 88-year-old Cardinal Fleury, wanted to stay out of it. He was old, he was tired, and he preferred peace and balanced budgets. But he was opposed by a powerful war party of ambitious nobles and generals, led by the charismatic Marshal de Belle-Isle. Belle-Isle and his faction saw this situation in Austria not as a crisis, but as the opportunity of a lifetime. For them, Malwitz was the final piece of evidence they needed. The Habsburg army was beatable. The Habsburg treasury was empty, and a young, supposedly weak woman was on the throne. They argued passionately in the gilded halls of Versailles that now was the time to strike, to end the Habsburg rivalry once and for all. Their plan was audacious. They would intervene in Germany, shatter the remaining Austrian forces, and carve up the Habsburg inheritance like a Thanksgiving turkey. They would ensure that the next Holy Roman Emperor was not a Habsburg, but their own puppet, Charles Albert of Bavaria. The war party won. The old cardinals' pleas for caution were drowned out by dreams of glory. France decided to throw its immense weight into the conflict, but they would be clever about it. They wouldn't declare war directly on Austria. That might look a bit unseemly, especially since they, too, had signed that pesky pragmatic sanction. Instead, they would act as the ally and protector of Bavaria. They would send their armies into Germany not as French invaders, but as a humble auxiliary force, there only to help the noble Charles Albert press his legitimate claim to the Austrian throne. It was a diplomatic fiction so thin you could read a newspaper through it, but it was all the excuse they needed. This decision triggers the escalation that turns a land grab into a world war. The Prussian victory at Malwitz, despite its flaws, proves that the Austrian military is no longer the titan it once was, and can be defeated on the battlefield. This evidence empowers the aggressive war party at the French court, who convinced King Louis XV to commit to a full-scale military intervention aimed at breaking Habsburg power permanently. Consequence: France engineers a grand anti-Habsburg coalition, uniting with Bavaria, Spain, and Saxony. The regional conflict over Silesia is now dwarfed by a massive European war dedicated to the total dismemberment of the Austrian monarchy. The dog pile has begun. Malwitz was a signal for every shark in Europe. Suddenly, the water was red, and everyone with a grudge and an army came rushing in for a bite. France, in particular, saw this as their main event. For 200 years, they'd been stuck in this existential rivalry with the Habsburgs. Now, they saw a chance to end it, to land the knockout blow and rearrange the entire map of Europe in their favor. Frederick just wanted a province. France wanted the whole damn company. Other vultures quickly joined the flock, and Spain. The ambitious Queen Elizabeth Farnese saw her chance to reclaim old Spanish territories in Italy, Milan, Parma, Tuscany that were now under Austrian rule. She eagerly signed on. The Elector of Saxony, Augustus III, was also tempted. His wife was another Habsburg cousin, giving him another flimsy claim. And the French promised him a piece of Austrian territory for his troubles in the summer of 1741. These ambitions were formalized in a series of agreements, most famously the Treaty of Nymphenburg. The new alliance laid out its plans for Austria's funeral. Charles Albert of Bavaria would get the Kingdom of Bohemia and the imperial crown. Spain would get its desired lands in Italy. Frederick, the man who started it all, would be formally guaranteed his prize, Silesia, and France, the architect of this grand demolition, would get the ultimate prize, a permanently weakened and broken rival, a puppet emperor on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, an undisputed status as the supreme power in Europe. For Maria Theresa in Vienna, the situation had gone from critical to apocalyptic. She was no longer fighting a single war against a Prussian opportunist. She was now facing a continental super-alliance, led by the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom in the world, all of them dedicated to wiping her empire off the map. to massive French armies, totaling over 80,000 men, were now preparing to march across the Rhine. The fight for Silesia was about to become a fight for survival. The summer of 1741 was the season of the lawyer. Before the Grand Coalition could unleash its armies, it had to first unleash its legal departments. Europe was suddenly buried in an avalanche of paper. It was a propaganda war fought with printing presses, a paper-based apocalypse of conflicting claims and historical grievances. Every court with a horse in the race published lengthy, tedious manifestos explaining why their impending act of violent aggression was, in fact, a deeply principled and legally sound act of justice. The French were the undisputed masters of this game. Marshal de Belle-Isle, the architect of the war, was also a genius of spin. He produced elegant documents insisting that France was not, technically, at war with Austria. Heavens, no, the French army was simply marching into Germany as an auxiliary force, a neutral party there to help its dear friend, Charles Albert of Bavaria, secure his rightful inheritance. They weren't invaders, they were disinterested referees, committed to upholding the ancient laws of the Holy Roman Empire. This was, of course, a lie of breathtaking proportions. But it was a lie printed on very expensive paper with a royal seal, so it carried a certain weight. Meanwhile, the Bavarians published their own genealogical theses, complete with complex family trees showing how, if you squinted and ignored several centuries of established law, Charles Albert's claim was clearly superior to Maria Theresa's. The Spanish issued similar proclamations about their ancient rights to Milan. It was a coordinated campaign of disinformation, designed to create a legal fog of war so thick that no one could see the simple truth. This was a coordinated mugging. Maria Theresa's diplomats fought back, frantically publishing counter-arguments, holding up the now worthless signatures on the pragmatic sanction and pointing out the coalition's blatant hypocrisy. But they were drowned out. The legal battle was a sideshow, a cynical charade performed for the benefit of the international community. And while the diplomats were busy arguing, the generals were busy marching. Cause the anti-Habsburg coalition, particularly France, needs to create a diplomatic smokescreen to justify their invasion and to slow down the reaction of potential Austrian allies, like Great Britain. In fact, they flood the courts of Europe with a dizzying array of legal pamphlets and official declarations that paint their aggression as a noble quest for justice, deliberately confusing the issue and making it difficult for neutral parties to get a clear picture of who the bad guy is. Consequence, this masterful campaign of shock and awe diplomacy buys them precious time, while Britain and the Dutch Republic are still trying to figure out the legal merits of a 15th century marriage contract. The massive Franco-Bavarian army is already crossing the Rhine, seizing an irreversible military initiative. This whole summer was the most elaborate and expensive pre-game show in history. You had diplomats in Paris writing 1,000-page essays on why their invasion was actually a peacekeeping mission, while 100 yards away, generals were signing orders to requisition every horse and bag of flour west of the Rhine. It's a masterclass in saying one thing while doing the complete, violent opposite. They weren't just breaking a treaty, they were burying it under a mountain of paperwork before stomping on its grave. Behind this paper curtain, the largest military mobilization in a generation was underway. To French armies, nearly 100,000 strong, assembled along the Rhine. One was under the command of the ambitious Belle-Isle, the other under the more experienced Marshal de Broglie. These were not the robotic killing machines of Prussia. The French army was a blunter, more flamboyant instrument, but its sheer size made it terrifying. Their plan was to march east, link up with the Bavarian army, and sweep through Austrian territory. Frederick the Great, meanwhile, watched all of this from Silesia with a growing sense of unease. He was now officially an ally of France, but he had no illusions. He had wanted to weaken Austria, not replace it with an all-powerful France. He had unleashed a monster that he wasn't sure he could control. He saw Belle-Isle's grand strategy not as a brilliant masterstroke, but as a clumsy plan that could easily backfire. For now, he played along, but the seeds of distrust were firmly planted. He was a partner in the crime, but he was already thinking about how to betray his fellow criminals. And in London, the British government watched the French mobilization with utter horror. British foreign policy was simple: oppose France, always, everywhere. They didn't particularly care about Maria Theresa or the pragmatic sanction, but the thought of a French-backed emperor and a dismembered Austria, leaving France as the undisputed master of Europe, was a geopolitical nightmare. King George II, who was also the Elector of Hanover in Germany, was personally invested. Parliament began to rumble. They weren't ready to send troops just yet, but the diplomatic and financial gears started to turn. A steady stream of British gold, the famous subsidies, began to flow to Vienna. A financial lifeline for the beleaguered queen, the charade was ending. The legal arguments had been made. The swords had been sharpened. In mid-August 1741, the great Franco-Bavarian army began to cross the Rhine. The target was not Vienna, not at first. The first objective was to march northeast, through Upper Austria and into Bohemia. They were coming for the ancient capital of Prague. In late summer of 1741, the great Franco-Bavarian army lumbered into motion. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight. A river of white-coated French infantry and blue-coated Bavarians flowing east into the heart of Germany. Their initial advance through Upper Austria was less of a military campaign and more of a victory parade. Maria Theresa's main army was still hundreds of miles away in Silesia, locked in a tense standoff with Frederick the Great. The few Austrian troops left to defend the homeland were hopelessly outnumbered and could do little more than harass the enemy's supply lines and then meld back into the forests. The direct road to Vienna was open, the Austrian capital was poorly defended, and the government was in a state of near panic. A bold, decisive thrust could have ended the entire war. In a matter of weeks, the French generals knew it. A quick capture of Vienna would have shattered Austrian morale and forced Maria Theresa to the negotiating table. But the coalition was hamstrung by its own political ambitions. The French commander, Marshal de Belleisle, was more of a diplomat than a general, and his primary goal wasn't just to beat Maria Theresa, but to build up his candidate, Charles Albert. He argued that it was more important to first secure a major political victory. They needed to capture the Kingdom of Bohemia. So, in a fateful decision, the Allied army turned north. Instead of marching on Vienna, they made for Prague, the ancient and beautiful capital of Bohemia. It was a strategic blunder of the highest order, trading a potential knockout blow for a symbolic victory. But the political logic was seductive. The crown of Bohemia was one of the most prestigious in Europe, and it was held by one of the 7 electors who chose the Holy Roman Emperor. By conquering Bohemia and crowning Charles Albert as its king, they would give his imperial candidacy an almost unstoppable momentum. The massive army arrived outside the walls of Prague in November. A long, costly siege seemed inevitable, but the Allies had an ace up their sleeve, a charismatic, illegitimate son of the King of Saxony named Maurice de Saxe, who was serving as a general in the French army. On a stormy night, November 26, 1741, Maurice led a small team of grenadiers on a daring raid. He found an unfortified, lightly guarded section of the medieval walls, scaled them in the driving rain, and seized a gate from the inside. The main army poured into the sleeping city. Prague had fallen, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The fall of the city immediately led to the coalition's greatest political triumph. Cause, the Franco-Bavarian army, prioritizing political legitimacy over military decisiveness, diverts its main force from a vulnerable Vienna to capture Prague. Effect, they easily seized the Bohemian capital, achieving their objective of controlling the kingdom and its electoral vote. Consequence, in December 1741, Charles Albert of Bavaria is crowned King of Bohemia with all the traditional pomp and ceremony in St. Vitus Cathedral. This act formally strips Maria Theresa of one of her most important titles and possessions, giving her rival an immense propaganda victory. This was the 18th century equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover. Charles Albert walked into Maria Theresa's regional headquarters, threw her portrait in the trash, and put his own nameplate on the door. The coronation was a massive publicity stunt designed to scream to the rest of Europe, "See? He's a legitimate king. We're not invaders. We're just management consultants helping with the leadership transition." It was a huge victory, but while they were busy planning the after-party in Prague, they had given Maria Theresa the one thing she desperately needed: time. For the moment, however, things looked utterly bleak for the young queen in Vienna. The news from Prague was devastating. She had now lost 2 of her richest domains, Silesia and Bohemia. Her enemy was wearing one of her crowns. It now seemed a foregone conclusion that this Bavarian pretender would soon be elected Holy Roman Emperor, ending a 300-year streak of Habsburg dominance. Her cause seemed hopeless. Her treasury was still empty. Her main army was still stuck in Silesia, unable to move for fear of what Frederick would do. Her only potential ally, Great Britain, was still just sending money, not soldiers. Every diplomat in Europe began to write her political obituary. The Habsburg Empire, that ancient pillar of the European order, was finished. It was surely time for the young queen to admit defeat, to accept the dismemberment of her inheritance, and to salvage what little she could from the wreckage. She was isolated, broke, and beaten. By any rational measure, the war was over. But Maria Theresa wasn't rational. She was furious, and she was about to make the most desperate, dramatic, and brilliant move of her entire career. By the autumn of 1741, Maria Theresa had been stripped of her titles, her lands, and her allies. Her back was against the wall. She had one last, desperate card to play, and it was a notoriously wild one: Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary was not just another Habsburg province. It was its own ancient, proud, and fiercely independent entity, bound to Austria by a shared monarch, but not by shared laws. The Hungarian nobility, the powerful magnates who ran the country, were famous for their rebellious streak. They had spent the last 2 centuries fighting Habsburg attempts to centralize power, jealously guarding their ancient liberties and constitution. Maria Theresa's Viennese advisors were horrified by her plan, turned to the Hungarians for help. It was madness. These were the same nobles who were constantly on the verge of revolt. Surely, they would see her weakness as an opportunity to extort devastating concessions, or perhaps even declare independence. To trust them now, in her moment of ultimate desperation, was a gamble that could cost her everything that was left. But Maria Theresa was out of options. She needed soldiers, and Hungary was the only place left that had them. She traveled to Pressburg, the Hungarian capital, to be formally crowned their queen and to address their parliament, the Diet. What happened next? On September 11, 1741, was not a political negotiation. It was a masterpiece of political theater. The hall was packed with hundreds of the most powerful men in Hungary, grizzled nobles in fur-trimmed cloaks, their hands resting on the pommels of their sabers. They were a tough crowd, skeptical and ready to drive a hard bargain. Maria Theresa entered, not as a glamorous empress, but as a woman in mourning. She was dressed in black, the traditional Hungarian style of a grieving widow. In her arms, she carried her infant son and heir, the future Emperor Joseph II. She spoke to them in flawless Latin, the official language of their government. She laid out the dire situation, describing how her lands were being overrun, her rights trampled, and her cause abandoned by all others. Then, raising her baby for all to see, her voice thick with emotion, she declared that she was entrusting the safety of her child, her crown, and her kingdom to their legendary chivalry and loyalty. It was a performance for the ages. This is the moment that saved her dynasty. Cause, pushed to the brink of total defeat, Maria Theresa stages a brilliantly emotional and highly personal appeal to the Hungarian Diets, bypassing political debate and appealing directly to their code of honor and chivalry. Effect: the proud Hungarian nobles, completely captivated by the sight of their beautiful young queen and her infant son in peril, have a collective emotional breakdown. Forgetting their grievances, they erupt in a passionate roar, famously shouting, "Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro Maria Theresia," our life and blood for our king, Maria Theresa. They called her king, not queen, the ultimate sign of respect, recognizing her as a true sovereign ruler. Consequence: the Diet immediately votes to raise a massive new army. The insurrection, a traditional mass levy of Hungarian troops, is proclaimed. Tens of thousands of ferocious soldiers are mobilized, giving Maria Theresa a powerful new fighting force. Just when everyone thought she was finished, this was one of the greatest PR stunts in history. It was pure, uncut political genius. Maria Theresa took a hostile business meeting and turned it into the final scene of a blockbuster movie. She knew exactly which buttons to press: honor, chivalry, and the sight of a baby. The Hungarian nobles, who walked in ready to argue about tax exemptions, walked out ready to die for her. Never underestimate the power of a good speech and a well-timed crying infant, of course. It wasn't just emotion. Maria Theresa also wisely swore her coronation oath, formally guaranteeing Hungary's constitutional privileges. It was a partnership, a deal sealed in a moment of high drama. The result was a flood of new soldiers. These weren't the clockwork infantry of Prussia. These were the wild men from the east, the world-famous hussars, the finest light cavalry in Europe, who could ride circles around the ponderous French armies. They were joined by the Pandurs, savage skirmishers from the military frontier, and thousands of tough, disciplined line infantry. This new Hungarian army was Maria Theresa's salvation. It was the ace she had hidden up her sleeve, a force her enemies had not accounted for. While the Franco-Bavarian army settled into comfortable winter quarters and conquered Prague, believing the war was won, a storm was gathering on the plains of Hungary. The tide was about to turn, violently. While a storm of Hungarian fury was gathering in the east, another, colder tide was beginning to turn in the west. The new player wasn't motivated by chivalry or ancient oaths, but by something far more reliable: an abiding, deep-seated, and pathological hatred of the French. It was time for Great Britain to wake up. 18th century British foreign policy was a beautifully simple machine. It had one lever, and it was marked balance of power. The entire goal was to ensure that no single country, and by no single country, they meant France, ever became powerful enough to dominate the European continent. They didn't particularly like the Habsburgs, but they saw a strong Austria as a necessary evil, a useful heavyweight to keep their arch-rival in Paris bogged down. The sight of French armies marching unchecked through Germany and installing their own puppet emperor was, for London, a five-alarm fire. It was their worst-case scenario playing out in real time. For 2 decades, British politics had been dominated by one man, Sir Robert Walpole, the country's first real prime minister. Walpole was a master politician whose guiding principle was peace at almost any price. He believed foreign wars were a pointless waste of money that disrupted trade, and he'd spent his entire career cleverly extricating Britain from continental squabbles. He was the one who had started sending Maria Theresa subsidies, but it was a pittance, just enough to keep her in the fight without truly committing British resources. He wanted to let the sleeping dogs of war lie. But the fall of Prague and the coronation of Charles Albert was a dog that wouldn't sleep. It barked so loudly it could be heard across the English Channel. In Parliament, a powerful war party, led by the fiery diplomat Lord Carteret, relentlessly attacked Walpole's cautious policy. They painted him as a weakling, an appeaser who was letting France win the world by default. King George II, himself a German prince as the Elector of Hanover, was also itching for a fight. He saw his own German territories threatened by the Franco-Prussian alliance and was desperate to get involved. The pressure on Walpole became immense. This political battle in London was a crucial turning point for the entire war. Cause, the spectacular success of the French-led invasion of Bohemia creates an existential crisis for British foreign policy, proving that their passive, subsidy-only approach has failed to contain French ambition. Effect, the political pressure becomes unbearable for the peace-loving Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, in February 1742. After 20 years in power, he is forced to resign. The interventionist war party, with Lord Carteret at the helm, takes control of the government. Consequence, Britain's involvement transforms from a quiet proxy war into active military intervention. They dramatically increase their financial support to Maria Theresa and begin assembling a large multinational army in the Netherlands, the Pragmatic Army, to directly challenge France and create a second front. For 20 years, Britain had been sitting on the sidelines, getting rich off trade and letting the Continentals punch each other. But France installing their own guy as CEO of the Holy Roman Empire was a red line. It's like watching your business rival buy up every other company on the block. Suddenly, Britain's "we don't get involved" policy went straight out the window, replaced by "get the checkbook and warm up the battleships." The world's richest country had just entered the chat, and they were ready to spend whatever it took to knock France down a peg. With Carteret calling the shots, the trickle of British gold flowing to Vienna became a torrent. This financial firepower was exactly what Maria Theresa needed to equip and pay for her new Hungarian armies. But Carteret went further. He began assembling a new army in the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. This pragmatic army was a classic 18th century composite force, a corps of red-coated British infantry, backed up by large contingents of German troops from Hanover loyal to King George and Hesse, rented for the occasion, as was the custom. The purpose of this army was twofold. First, it was a very large bodyguard for Hanover, daring the French to attack the king's personal territory. Second, and more importantly, it was designed to open a new front. It would force the French to divert tens of thousands of their best troops away from the war in Bohemia to face this new threat on their northern border. The plan was simple: make France bleed, make them fight onto fronts, stretching their resources and weakening their main effort against Austria. The great European dogpile was now getting a new, very large dog. The French and their allies, who just months before had been celebrating their seemingly effortless victory in Prague, were now about to face a nightmare scenario: a resurgent, furious Austrian-Hungarian army attacking from the east and a wealthy, determined Anglo-German army preparing to strike from the west. The local smash and grab was now officially a world war, as the great powers of Europe began to choose sides. Frederick the Great sat in his newly conquered province of Silesia and did some cold, hard math. He had started this whole mess with a simple goal: take Silesia. Goal achieved. But now, his brilliant little land grab had metastasized into a potential continent-wide French victory party, and he wasn't the guest of honor. He was just the guy who opened the door for them. He watched with growing horror as the massive French army swept through Germany. He saw them capture Prague and crown their Bavarian puppet. This was not part of the plan. His goal was to establish Prussia as a new great power. to create a balance where he could play a key role. He did not want to be a junior partner in a new European order dictated from Paris. He had helped weaken the Habsburgs, but in doing so, he feared he had accidentally helped create a Bourbon superpower that would be an even greater threat. Frederick realized he had unleashed a monster, and he needed a way to get out of the room before it ate him too. His anxiety did not go unnoticed. In London, the new war government led by Lord Carteret saw a golden opportunity. Their main objective was to break the Franco-Prussian alliance. They dispatched their best diplomats, most notably Lord Hinford, to Frederick's camp with a simple, seductive proposal. You've got what you came for. How about you quit the war, and we'll get Maria Theresa to let you keep your loot? It was a direct appeal to Frederick's cynical self-interest, so, while his French allies were busy planning their next moves from Prague, Frederick began a series of top-secret, cloak-and-dagger negotiations with the Austrians, with the British acting as mediators. This was a breathtaking act of betrayal. He was bound by a solemn treaty to France. But that treaty had now become inconvenient in Vienna. Maria Theresa was initially apoplectic at the idea of negotiating with that evil man, Cid Silesia. Never, but her generals and her new British paymasters urged pragmatism. Her best army was currently tied down in Silesia, staring uselessly at the Prussians. While the French and Bavarians were running rampant in Bohemia, what if she could cut a deal, however distasteful, to pause the Prussian front and free up that army to go save the rest of her kingdom? Reluctantly, she agreed. The result was the Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf, signed in secret on October 9, 1741. This wasn't a formal peace treaty. It was a gentleman's agreement between scoundrels, a temporary truce. Cause, Frederick becomes terrified that the stunning success of his French allies will lead to a French-dominated Europe, a scenario far more dangerous to Prussia's future than a crippled Austria. Effect, he acts on pure self-interest and enters into secret negotiations with Maria Theresa's camp, mediated by the British, to secure his conquest of Silesia and get out of the wider war he started. Consequence, he signs the secret Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf. This spectacular act of betrayal neutralizes the Silesian front, allowing the entire Austrian army under Neipperg to disengage and march west to confront the unsuspecting Franco-Bavarian forces, completely upending the strategic situation. This is Frederick the Great in a nutshell, 100% pure, uncut, shameless self-interest. He started the fire, and the moment it got too big and threatened to burn his own drapes, he cut a deal with the owner of the house he was robbing. His alliance with France lasted just long enough for him to get what he wanted: loyalty, honor, treaty obligations. To Frederick, those were just suggestions, easily ignored if they became inconvenient. He was playing his own game, and everyone else on the board was just a pawn. The terms of the truce were a masterpiece of 18th century deception. The Austrian army under Neipperg would be allowed to retreat from Silesia unmolested. To keep up appearances for the French, the last Austrian-held fortress, Nice, would undergo a sham siege for 2 weeks before surrendering to the Prussians. This gave Frederick full control of the province, while allowing the Austrians to redeploy their best army. It was a win-win for the two enemies, and a complete stab in the back for their respective allies. With the secret deal done, Frederick settled back with his flute and his philosophy books. He had his prize. Neipperg's army was now quietly slipping away, marching to relieve the pressure on Vienna and challenge the French in Bohemia. The French commanders in Prague, completely oblivious to this treachery, were about to get the shock of their lives. A battle-hardened Austrian army they thought was pinned down hundreds of miles away was now heading straight for them. Frederick's secret truce, the Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf, was a brilliant, cynical, and entirely self-serving piece of diplomacy. For the winter of 1741-1742, it worked perfectly. While his former French allies were freezing in Bohemia, wondering where the hell this fresh Austrian army came from, Frederick sat comfortably in Silesia, reorganizing his new province and writing flute concertos. He was officially a neutral observer, a man of peace. He sent polite, non-committal letters to both sides, expressing his sincere hope that they'd all stop fighting soon, all while knowing he was the one who had sixed the Austrians on the French in the first place. But the truce was built on a foundation of pure convenience, and convenience is a fickle thing. Frederick had wanted to clip Austria's wings, not give them a new engine. To his profound alarm, the Austrian counterattack, fueled by Hungarian manpower and British cash, was stunningly successful. A new Austrian army, led by General Kevin-Hiller, didn't just push the French and Bavarians back, it thrashed them. They recaptured Austrian cities, drove deep into Bavaria, and were making the invaders' lives a frozen hell. This put Frederick in a very awkward position. He had gotten out of the war, Because he feared a total French victory, now he was faced with the opposite. Equally terrifying prospect, a total Austrian victory. What would a resurgent, vengeful Maria Theresa do once she was finished with the French? She certainly wouldn't honor a secret, informal truce made under duress. She would, without a doubt, turn her victorious armies north and come for Silesia. His brilliant little betrayal was in danger of backfiring spectacularly. He needed the war in Germany to be a long, grinding stalemate that would bleed both France and Austria white, leaving them too exhausted to ever bother him again. The final straw came in January 1742. While the war raged, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire finally cast their votes. As expected, their French-backed candidate, Charles Albert of Bavaria, was elected emperor. Taking the title Charles VII, it was a huge political victory for Frederick's allies. The problem: on the very day of his coronation in Frankfurt, Austrian troops marched into his own capital, Munich. The new Holy Roman Emperor was officially a homeless refugee. This was Frederick's cue. The Austrians were getting too strong, too fast. His ally, the emperor, was a laughing stock. The delicate balance of power he wanted was tipping dangerously in Austria's favor. It was time to get back in the game. It was time for betrayal to electric boogaloo. In a move that left even the most jaded European diplomats speechless, Frederick unilaterally broke his secret truce. Cause: the unexpected and dramatic success of the Austrian counteroffensive against the Franco-Bavarian forces threatens to create a powerful, resurgent Austria, which Frederick views as a direct threat to his long-term possession of Silesia. Effect: his secret truce with Austria is no longer strategically convenient. To prevent an Austrian victory and keep them entangled in Germany, he decides to reignite the war on his own terms. Consequence: with almost no warning, Frederick breaks the convention of Klein-Schnellendorf and launches a fresh invasion, this time marching his army out of Silesia and into the neighboring Austrian province of Moravia. This forces the Austrians to once again divide their forces, saving the French from collapse and ensuring the war will become a protracted bloodbath. Frederick's foreign policy had the loyalty and consistency of a weather vane in a hurricane. One minute, he's betraying the French to help the Austrians. The next, he's betraying the Austrians to help the French. It wasn't about allies or enemies. It was about his profit and loss statement. He saw the war as a giant sound mixer, and his only job was to keep tweaking the levels so that nobody else's music ever got louder than his. The man had zero chill and even less integrity. His excuse for this new invasion was laughably thin. He announced that he simply could not stand by and watch his friend and ally, the newly crowned emperor, be driven from his own lands. He was marching into Moravia to create a diversion to help the French. No one was fooled. The French were furious at being so obviously manipulated. The Austrians were incandescent with rage at this second, even more brazen betrayal. The British, who had brokered the secret deal, were utterly disgusted, but disgust doesn't stop an army. In early 1742, the Prussian war machine was on the move again. Heading south towards Vienna, Frederick, the master puppeteer, was pulling the strings once more, ensuring the bloody show would go on. But this time, he was not marching against a surprised and disorganized enemy. He was about to find out what it was like to fight an Austrian army that was angry, prepared, and out for his blood. Frederick's second betrayal, his sudden invasion of Moravia, was designed to be a masterstroke. He intended to force Maria Theresa to her knees by threatening Vienna itself, all while heroically saving his French allies. Instead, he found himself in a quagmire. The Austrians, now battle-hardened and utterly furious, refused to play his game. Maria Theresa, showing the strategic sense that was becoming her trademark, did not panic. She split her forces. A large army under her brother-in-law, Prince Charles of Lorraine, was sent to shadow and contain Frederick, while her other, arguably better, commander was unleashed. This is where the Austrian zombie apocalypse begins. General Ludwig Andreas von Khevenhuller, a brilliant and aggressive commander, was given command of the army facing the Bavarians and the French in the west. And in the bleak winter of 1741-1742, he went on one of the most devastatingly effective rampages of the entire war. His army was now bolstered by the first wave of the Hungarian levy, thousands of wild hussars and Pander skirmishers. These were not soldiers who stood in neat lines and fired orderly volleys. They were specialists in terror. They swarmed the countryside, ambushing supply convoys, slitting sentries' throats in the dead of night, and appearing out of nowhere to cut down foraging parties. The French, accustomed to the more stately, predictable warfare of Western Europe, were completely unnerved. Khevenhuller's regular troops advanced relentlessly behind this screen of terror. They recaptured the city of Linz. They pushed the French support army out of Upper Austria. And then, In a move of exquisite, deliberate humiliation, Kevin Huller marched his army straight into the heart of Bavaria. On January 24, 1742, his triumphant Austrian troops entered Munich, the capital city of Bavaria. By sheer, glorious coincidence, this was the exact same day that the city's ruler, Charles Albert, was in Frankfurt being crowned Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII. The man had just been declared the most powerful secular ruler in Christendom, and he couldn't even get into his own palace. This stunning turnaround creates a new reality on the ground. Cause, Maria Theresa leverages her new Hungarian troops and a brilliant general, Kevin Huller, to launch an unexpectedly ferocious winter counteroffensive, while simultaneously using a separate army to bog down Frederick's second invasion. Effect, the Austrian army completely overruns Bavaria, the home base of the coalition's imperial candidate, capturing its capital, Munich, and shattering the enemy's logistical support and morale. Consequence, the entire Franco-Bavarian strategic position in Germany collapses. Their main army in Bohemia is now isolated, deep in hostile territory, with a victorious Austrian army sitting on its supply lines. The puppet emperor is exposed as a powerless refugee, and Austria, left for dead just months earlier, is now firmly on the offensive. This is the part of the movie where the hero, beaten and bloodied, gets a second wind. Austria was supposed to be dead and buried. Instead, they came roaring back to life like a zombie army fueled by sheer rage and Hungarian light cavalry. They didn't just stop the French advance. They kicked in the invaders' front door and started repossessing their furniture. It was one of the most stunning military reversals of the 18th century. And it proved one thing: never, ever count the Habsburgs out. While Kevin Huller was conquering Bavaria, Frederick the Great was having a miserable time in Moravia. His invasion stalled. The locals, far from welcoming him, mounted a fierce guerrilla resistance. Austrian hussars, commanded by the same Hungarians who were terrorizing the French, shredded his supply lines. He failed to capture the key fortress of Brno. After a few months of frustrating and costly campaigning, which culminated in a bloody but indecisive battle at Chautusitz, Frederick realized he had miscalculated badly. In the late spring of 1742, he sullenly retreated back to Silesia. His grand strategic gambit had been a failure. By the summer of 1742, the war had been turned completely on its head. The Austrian comeback was real and spectacular. The main French army was now surrounded and besieged in Prague by Prince Charles's victorious army. The Holy Roman Emperor was a king without a kingdom, and Frederick was back where he started, in Silesia, having gained nothing from his latest adventure except a longer butcher-esque bill and the eternal hatred of Maria Theresa. The hunter had very much become the hunted. There is a special, delicious kind of irony reserved for those whose ambitions wildly outstrip their abilities. And in the winter of 1742, no one was experiencing this more profoundly than the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VII. Just a few months earlier, he had been the conquering hero, the man crowned king of Bohemia in a captured city, the challenger who had broken 3 centuries of Habsburg dominance. In January, in a lavish ceremony in Frankfurt, he was elected emperor, achieving the ultimate prize. He was, on paper, the successor to Charlemagne and the Caesars. His reality was slightly less glamorous. While the imperial crown was being placed on his head in Frankfurt, Austrian soldiers were busy kicking down the doors of his palace in Munich. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was homeless, chased out of his own capital by the very woman whose inheritance he had schemed to dismantle. Charles became a political punchline. He was forced to hold his imperial court in a series of rented rooms in Frankfurt. A powerless monarch in exile, he had the title, the robes, and the fancy hat. But he didn't have a country. He could issue grand imperial decrees, but they had less authority than a tavern owner's bar tab. Maria Theresa, meanwhile, was not a forgiving winner. She savored her revenge. With her army firmly in control of Bavaria, she implemented a policy of systematic humiliation. She summoned the Bavarian nobility to the Austrian city of Linz and forced them, one by one, to kneel and swear an oath of fealty to her. She was now the acting ruler of her rival's homeland. Better yet, the Austrian administration began collecting all of Bavaria's taxes. The money that was supposed to fund Charles VII's imperial ambitions was now being wired directly to Vienna to pay for the Austrian armies that were actively hunting his French allies. His own country was now bankrolling his destruction. This complete reversal of fortune created a chain reaction of pure, unadulterated failure. Cause, the swift and brutal Austrian conquest of Bavaria strips the new Emperor Charles VII of his territorial, military, and financial power base at the precise moment of his coronation. Effect, he is immediately transformed from the coalition's greatest political asset into its most pathetic liability, a powerless exile with a hollow title, completely dependent on French charity. Consequence, the entire French political strategy collapses. Their project to replace the Habsburgs with a strong, client emperor fails spectacularly, as their client is now a penniless refugee. This immense humiliation shatters the prestige and momentum of the anti-Austrian alliance. This is a level of historical irony so thick you could cut it with a knife. Charles Albert started this whole thing by trying to steal Maria Theresa's house, and he ended up getting evicted from his own. He's got the crown, the scepter, and the fancy orb, but he can't even get past the Austrian bouncer standing at the front door of his own capital. He's the Holy Roman Emperor of a hotel room in Frankfurt. It's the ultimate case of be careful what you wish for, because the woman you tried to rob might just repossess your entire country. For the French, this was a diplomatic and military catastrophe. Their grand puppet was a joke, their entire justification for the war to install a legitimate new emperor was undermined when that emperor couldn't even rule his own hometown. The war effort, which had been a glorious march of conquest, now became a desperate and expensive rescue mission. Instead of focusing their resources on breaking Austria, they now had to divert armies and treasure to the humiliating task of trying to win back Bavaria for their hapless emperor. This disaster also sealed the fate of the French army trapped in Prague under Marshal de Broglie. Their situation went from dangerous to hopeless, with the Austrians holding Bavaria. There was no safe territory to retreat to. They were an isolated island in a sea of hostile, Hussar-infested territory. The great anti-Habsburg crusade had degenerated into a scramble for survival, all symbolized by the sad, wandering figure of the homeless emperor. Maria Theresa's personal comeback was now complete. She had not only defended her own lands, she had taken her enemies. While the Austrians were busy repossessing Bavaria, the other half of the anti-French pincer was finally creaking into motion, the Pragmatic Army. That multinational force of British, Hanoverian, and Hessian soldiers bankrolled by London began its march from the Netherlands into Germany in the spring of 1743. Their goal was to menace the French and support their Austrian allies, and they had a very special commander-in-chief, King George II of Great Britain. George was 60 years old, short, stout, and possessed a famously volcanic temper. He was also a professional soldier at heart. Bored of politics in London, he decided to take personal command of his army in the field. This was a throwback, a medieval gesture in a powdered wig world. It would be the last time a reigning British monarch ever personally led his troops into the smoke of battle, and it was almost a complete disaster. The French responded by sending a skilled and cunning general, the Duc de Noailles, to intercept and destroy this new threat. Near the village of Dettingen on the River Main, Noailles laid a perfect trap. He positioned his army brilliantly, catching the Pragmatic Army in a narrow strip of land between the river on one side and impassable hills on the other. He set up his artillery to rake their path forward, while sending a large force, commanded by his nephew the Duc de Gramont, across a bridge to block their line of retreat. The Pragmatic Army, marching clumsily and with poor reconnaissance, walked straight into the kill zone. They were trapped, pinned down, and facing annihilation. Noailles had them. And then, in a moment of sublime stupidity, the French snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. The Duc de Gramont, the nephew, was a proud and impetuous young man. He saw the Allied army in disarray before him and couldn't resist the chance to win all the glory for himself, ignoring his uncle's strict orders to simply hold his position and complete the encirclement. He ordered a full-scale charge. He abandoned his perfect defensive position and launched his elite cavalry straight at the Allied lines. It was a move of pure, unadulterated arrogance, and it blew the entire plan. The sudden French charge threw the Allies into chaos. King George II's horse, startled by the cannon fire, bolted and nearly carried him off the field. But the king was no coward. Furious, he managed to bring the horse to a halt, dismounted, and drew his sword. Too stout to remount quickly, he simply began walking toward the front lines, bellowing orders in his thick German accent. He personally took command of his British and Hanoverian infantry, organizing them into a long, stubborn line of red and blue coats. This single act of idiocy completely rewrote the battle script. Cause, the French commander, the Duc de Gramont, blinded by a hunger for personal glory, blatantly disobeys his orders and launches a premature, unsupported frontal assault, abandoning his tactically perfect blocking position. Effect, his glorious charge smashes uselessly against the disciplined lines of British and Hanoverian infantry, who, personally rallied by a furious, dismounted King George II. stand like a rock and unleash devastating, point-blank volleys. Consequence, the elite French cavalry is shattered and thrown back with horrific casualties, causing a panic that spreads through the entire French army. The pragmatic army, which was on the verge of being annihilated, stumbles out of the trap and into a messy, improbable, but hugely significant victory. This battle is a perfect comedy of errors. The French general sets a flawless trap, and his nephew ruins it by having a Leroy Jenkins moment. The British king's horse runs away, so he gets off and leads the fight on foot, probably because he was too angry to be scared. The Allies won a battle they had no business winning, saved only by the epic blunder of their opponent. It's a miracle anyone knew who to give the medals to. The Battle of Dettingen, fought on June 27, 1743, was a tactical mess but a strategic triumph. The French army was beaten and forced to retreat. Their defeat, combined with the Austrian successes in Bavaria, compelled them to pull all their remaining forces out of Germany to defend their own borders. For Maria Theresa, the relief was immense. Her German lands were now clear of invaders. For Britain, it was a massive boost to national pride. Their grumpy old king was a war hero. The anti-French coalition now had serious momentum. The tide of the war had well and truly turned, with the French licking their wounds after the disaster at Dettingen, and the Austrians triumphant in Bavaria. A strange, deceptive quiet settled over Germany in late 1743 and early 1744. For the first time in years, Maria Theresa was winning decisively. Her armies, under her brother-in-law Prince Charles of Lorraine, had not only cleared her lands of invaders, but were now massed on the banks of the Rhine, threatening to invade France itself. In London, her British allies were cheering. In Vienna, she was hailed as a savior. And in his palace in Berlin, Frederick the Great was having a panic attack. This was his recurring nightmare. A victorious Austria, flush with cash from Britain and backed by a powerful alliance, was a far greater threat to his possession of Silesia than a defeated one. He had jumped back and forth, betraying both sides, all in the name of maintaining a delicate, bloody equilibrium, whereas the biggest rivals were too busy fighting each other to worry about him. Now that equilibrium was shattered, Austria was on the verge of crushing France, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that as soon as they were done, their first stop would be a vengeful return trip to Silesia. He could not let that happen. The peace he had enjoyed for 2 years was now more dangerous than war. It was time, once again, to set the world on fire to keep himself warm. He began his scheme with his usual flair for diplomatic hypocrisy. He reached out to the other nervous princes of the Holy Roman Empire and formed the League of Frankfurt. He then presented himself to the world not as an aggressor, but as a noble protector. He was only acting, he claimed, to defend the liberties of the German Empire and to restore the poor, homeless Emperor Charles VII to his rightful lands. It was a brilliant PR move, wrapping his naked self-interest in the flag of German patriotism. He then went to the French, who were desperate for any help they could get, and essentially offered to save them from a catastrophic defeat. They reluctantly agreed to bankroll his new adventure. Then, in August 1744, he struck. Following his now classic playbook, he launched a massive 80,000-man invasion without any declaration of war. But this time, he didn't waste his time in Moravia. He marched straight for the heart of the matter, Bohemia. This was the beginning of the Second Silesian War. The timing was perfect and devastatingly effective. The main Austrian army, the best and most experienced troops Maria Theresa had, was hundreds of miles away on the French border, preparing for their glorious invasion of Alsace. Bohemia was almost completely defenseless. The entire strategic board is flipped, again, by one man's paranoia. Cause, the stunning success of the Austro-British alliance in 1743. 44 pushes France to the brink of defeat and positions Austria to become the undisputed dominant power on the continent. Effect, a deeply alarmed Frederick, convinced that a victorious Austria will inevitably move to reclaim Silesia, concocts a new alliance and a new excuse to re-enter the war. Consequence, he launches a massive surprise invasion of Bohemia, catching the Austrians completely unprepared. This forces the main Austrian army to abandon its long-planned invasion of France and begin a frantic, desperate march back across Germany to defend the Habsburg heartlands. Frederick has single-handedly saved his French enemies. Just when you thought he was out, he pulls himself back in. Frederick is like the most toxic ex in history. The second he sees his former enemy, Austria, starting to live their best life and get successful, he has to come crashing back in to ruin everything. His new excuse, "I'm defending German liberties," it was the 18th century equivalent of saying, "I'm starting this fight for ethical reasons." Nobody believed him for a second, but his 80,000-man army was a pretty convincing argument. The invasion was a textbook success. The Prussians poured into Bohemia, meeting little resistance. By early September, they had surrounded Prague. After a short and brutal siege, the city surrendered for the second time in 3 years, first to the French and Bavarians, now to the Prussians. Frederick had achieved his initial objective with stunning speed. He had plunged a dagger into Austria's back, saved France, and thrown the entire war back into chaos. But now he was deep in enemy territory, with winter approaching, and the full weight of a furious, vengeful Austrian army was thundering back towards him. Frederick's invasion of Bohemia in 1744 was a gift to the French. It was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. Just as the main Austrian army was about to crash across the Rhine into France, they were forced to turn around and race back across Germany. This gave France exactly what it needed, breathing room, and they used that room to go on the offensive. With the Austrian threat neutralized, France turned its full attention to the pragmatic army of the British and their allies in the Austrian Netherlands, and this time, the French had a new commander, one of the authentic military geniuses of the century, Maurice de Saxe. Marshal Saxe was a brilliant, charismatic, and thoroughly professional soldier. He was also chronically ill with edema, so sick that he often had to be carried around the battlefield in a wicker chair. It was a terrifying sight for his enemies, a dying man in a deck hair, calmly orchestrating their annihilation. In the spring of 1745, Saxe led his revitalized French army into Flanders and laid siege to the critical fortress city of Tournai. The Allies, now under the command of King George's 24-year-old son, the Duke of Cumberland, had no choice but to march to the city's relief. Cumberland was brave, aggressive, and completely out of his depth. He was about to play checkers against the Grand Master. On May 11th, 1745, the two armies met near the village of Fontenoy. Saxe, who had arrived days earlier, had chosen his ground with surgical precision. He created a defensive masterpiece, anchoring his lines on fortified villages and a series of specially constructed redoubts. He essentially dared the Allied army to attack him uphill, straight into a pre-sighted killing field of interlocking cannon and musket fire. Cumberland, lacking imagination, took the dare. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of the age. The Allied army launched a massive frontal assault. The Dutch and Austrians on the flanks were repulsed, but in the center, the British and Hanoverian infantry did something incredible. In a massive 15,000-man column, they advanced into the teeth of the French defenses. They marched with parade ground discipline, stopping to dress their lines as cannonballs ripped horrific holes in their ranks. In a display of almost inhuman stoicism, they absorbed devastating fire, crossed the field, and smashed right through the main French infantry line. For one brief, glorious moment, it seemed their sheer, stubborn courage would win the day. This led to the battle's iconic, if possibly apocryphal, moment. The British officers at the head of the column found themselves face to face with the elite French Guards Francaise. An English officer allegedly stepped forward, raised a flask, and shouted, "We hope you will stand till we come up to you, and not swim the Scheldt as you did the Main at Dettingen." A French officer retorted, "Gentlemen of the English Guards, fire first." The bloody climax was swift and decisive. Cause, the Allied army under the Duke of Cumberland makes a tactically simplistic frontal assault against the perfectly prepared defensive position established by the brilliant Marshal Saxe. Effect, the incredible discipline of the British and Hanoverian infantry allows them to break the first French line. But this very success leaves them isolated and unsupported, a single column taking catastrophic fire from three sides. Consequence, Marshal Saxe, though desperately ill, masterfully organizes and launches a perfectly timed, all-out counterattack with his fresh reserves, including the ferocious Irish Brigade. The exhausted and bloodied Allied column is shattered and driven from the field in a disastrous rout. Fontenoy was the anti-Dettingen. This time, the French had the brilliant general, and the Allies had the guy who just ordered charge straight ahead. The British infantry were unbelievably tough. They marched through a hurricane of cannonballs and broke the French line, which is insane. But bravery is no substitute for a good plan. They were like a very determined bull charging a matador who was also an expert surgeon. The result was a glorious, heroic, and incredibly bloody disaster for the Allies. France was back in business. The pragmatic army was broken. Tournai fell soon after, followed by a string of other key cities in Flanders. The French were now the undisputed masters of the Austrian Netherlands. While Frederick was fighting for his survival in the east, France had scored its single greatest victory of the war in the west. The momentum had swung violently back in their favor, and now, They had a clever plan to make sure the British were too busy to recover. After the glorious, bloody mess at Fontenoy, Marshal Saxe and the French army were the kings of the Low Countries. They had smashed their main opponent on the field, but the French government in Paris knew that as long as Great Britain remained in the war, the fight was far from over. British naval power could strangle their trade, and the bottomless pit of the British treasury could fund new armies for Austria forever. A direct invasion of England was impossible. Thanks to the Royal Navy, they needed a cheaper, cleverer way to take Britain off the board, so they reached for a classic tool in their political toolkit, sponsoring a civil war. For decades, France had given refuge to the exiled Stuart dynasty, the Catholic kings who had been kicked out of Britain in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The movement to restore them, known as Jacobitism, was a constant, low-level threat to the ruling Hanoverian dynasty of King George II. The French plan was simple and vicious. Find the current Stuart claimant, give him a boat and some money, and drop him in Scotland to start a rebellion. The goal wasn't even necessarily for him to win. The goal was to create chaos, to light a fire in Britain's own backyard that would force them to pull all their troops and attention back home. The man for the job was Charles Edward Stuart, known to history and romantic legend as Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was 24 years old, handsome, charismatic, and possessed a reckless ambition that bordered on delusional. In July 1745, with French backing, but crucially without a French army, Charles landed on the west coast of Scotland with a grand total of 7 companions. It was an absurdly bold gamble. He was counting on the fierce loyalty of the Highland clans, many of whom were Catholic and still yearned for a Stuart king, to the astonishment of everyone, especially the government in London. The gamble worked. Several powerful clans rallied to his tartan banner. His small, fierce Jacobite army marched out of the Highlands, scattered the few government troops in their way, and in mid-September, they captured the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, a few days later. At the Battle of Prestonpans, they met a larger but inexperienced British army and annihilated it. In under 10 minutes, the rebellion was real, and it was winning. This was the ultimate strategic diversion, to exploit their victory at Fontenoy and neutralize Great Britain. The French government sponsors a Jacobite landing in Scotland, aiming to ignite a civil war that will cripple the British ability to fight on the continent. Effect: the rebellion, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, achieved stunning and unexpected early success, seizing Scotland and destroying the local British army, which causes mass panic in London. Consequence: the British are forced to do exactly what France had hoped. They recall the Duke of Cumberland and 12,000 of their best veteran troops from the army in Flanders to deal with the crisis at home. Britain's land war in Europe is effectively put on hold. This was a masterstroke of asymmetric warfare by the French. Why fight the British army in Flanders when you can get them to leave the continent entirely by starting a fire in their backyard? For the price of a few ships and some pocket money, they unleashed one charming, killed-wearing aristocrat who caused more panic in London than a whole French army could have. It was the 18th century version of a strategic hack. The panic was justified. Fresh from his victory at Prestonpans, Charles and his Highland army crossed the border and marched south into England. They captured Carlisle. They marched through Manchester. By early December 1745, they had reached Derby, only 130 miles from London. The capital was thrown into a state of utter hysteria. Shops closed. There was a run on the Bank of England. Wealthy merchants began packing their bags. King George II, it was rumored, had a yacht waiting on the Thames to ferry him back to the safety of Hanover. For a few terrifying weeks, it looked as though the ragtag army of Scottish Highlanders might actually topple the most powerful government in the world. The French plan had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The British redcoats were frantically sailing home. Marshal Saxe now had a free hand to continue his conquest of the Austrian Netherlands without British interference, and the British government was facing its greatest existential crisis in a century. The Continental War had come home to roost, while Britain was imploding with the Jacobite rebellion. The man who had started that particular fire by proxy was fighting for his own survival. Frederick the Great 1740 for invasion of Bohemia had started brilliantly, but it ended in a humiliating disaster. After taking Prague, he was outmaneuvered by the main Austrian army under Prince Charles. The winter retreat back to Silesia was a nightmare. Harassed by Hungarian hussars and a hostile populace, Frederick's perfectly drilled army dissolved, losing nearly half its strength to desertion, starvation, and disease. He limped back into Silesia in early 1745, a beaten man. In Vienna, there was jubilation. Maria Theresa saw her moment. Frederick was weakened, his army was shattered, and his reputation was in tatters. This was her chance to end the Prussian menace forever and take back her stolen province. She renewed her alliance with Saxony, and together they drew up a bold plan for a final, decisive blow. In the summer of 1745, a massive Austro-Saxon army, once again under the command of Prince Charles, would invade Silesia. A second Saxon army would then march from the west to capture Berlin itself. It was a plan for total annihilation. Prince Charles marched his 60,000 men into Silesia with supreme confidence. His scouts reported that Frederick was in retreat, his army still in disarray. But Frederick was not retreating. He was hunting. He deliberately fed the Allies false intelligence, luring them deeper into Silesia, into a valley near Hohenfriedberg that he had chosen with meticulous care. There, hidden behind a line of hills, his revitalized army lay in wait on the morning of June 4th, 1745. As the Allied army was just waking up, the Prussian army attacked. The surprise was absolute. Frederick unleashed his forces in a perfectly timed, coordinated assault, smashing the unprepared Saxon wing of the Allied army before turning his full attention to the Austrians. The battle raged for hours, but its outcome was sealed by one of the most legendary charges in military history. The Bayreuth Dragoons, an elite Prussian heavy cavalry regiment, saw a gap in the Austrian lines. On their own initiative, they charged. They crashed through the Austrian defenses, wheeled, and slammed into the flank of 20 battalions of elite Austrian infantry, shattering them completely. In a matter of minutes, they captured 2,500 prisoners, 67 battle flags, and effectively broke the back of the Austrian army. The result was a masterpiece of tactical genius. Faced with a seemingly overwhelming Austro-Saxon invasion aimed at his destruction, Frederick the Great used his cunning deception to lure his overconfident enemies into a perfectly laid trap. At the Battle of Hohenfriedberg, he achieves total surprise in his army, culminating in a devastating and decisive charge by the Bayreuth Dragoons, inflicts a catastrophic defeat on the Allied forces. Consequence, the main Allied army is routed, and their grand plan to conquer Prussia is left in smoking ruins. The battle instantly restores Frederick's reputation, demonstrates the terrifying power of the Prussian army under his direct command, and makes it brutally clear that Silesia will not be retaken by force. After his embarrassing Bohemian vacation, everyone thought Freddy was washed up. The Austrians and Saxons marched into Silesia like they were showing up for a victory parade. That had already been scheduled. Big mistake. Frederick, now fighting with his back against the wall, stopped being a political schemer and became a stone-cold military artist. Hohenfriedberg wasn't just a victory, it was a masterpiece of destruction. It was Frederick's way of saying, "You want Silesia? Come and get it through this wall of cannonballs and angry dragoons." The year of victory was not over, though shattered. The Austrians regrouped in Bohemia. Frederick pursued them and at the Battle of Soor in September, won another hard-fought victory, this time against a surprise attack where he was outnumbered. Meanwhile, he learned the Saxon army was still planning to march on Berlin. He dispatched his grizzled old field marshal, Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, to intercept them. In December, at the Battle of Kesselsdorf, the Prussians crushed the Saxons for good and marched into their capital city, Dresden. The campaign of 1745 was Frederick's magnum opus. In the space of 6 months, he had faced down a two-front invasion designed to extinguish his kingdom, and had won 3 decisive battles, crushing both his enemies. Maria Theresa's dream of reconquering Silesia was shattered on the bayonets of the Prussian infantry. The military argument was over. The province was his. While Frederick the Great was busy orchestrating his military masterpieces at Hohenfriedberg and Kesselsdorf, the entire political foundation of the war was suddenly and quietly demolished. Not by a cannonball, but by a case of gout, the centerpiece of the grand anti-Habsburg alliance. The man whose claim had justified the whole bloody affair was the sad, homeless Emperor Charles VII. His health, broken by years of stress, humiliation, and rich food, finally gave out. On January 20th, 1745, he died in Munich, the capital he had only recently and temporarily regained. He was just 47 years old. His death was a political earthquake. It was the luckiest break Maria Theresa would get in the entire war. The central pillar of the French and Prussian cause had simply vanished. Their entire legal pretext for being in Germany was to support the claims and legitimacy of Emperor Charles VII, but now he was dead. The imperial throne of the Holy Roman Empire was vacant. Once again, it is remarkably difficult to fight a war on behalf of a corpse. Maria Theresa, a masterful politician, saw her opportunity and seized it with both hands. Her primary political goal had always been to restore the imperial crown to her family by getting her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, elected, with Charles VII out of the way. The path was now clear. The first step was to deal with Bavaria, the dead emperor's son and heir. Maximilian III Joseph was a far more pragmatic man than his father. He looked at his ruined, occupied country and decided he wanted no more of his father's disastrous imperial fantasy. He just wanted peace. Maria Theresa offered him an easy way out. In April 1745, they signed the Treaty of Fussen. It was a remarkably generous deal. Austria agreed to withdraw from Bavaria and officially recognized the legitimacy of the late Charles VII's reign, a meaningless but diplomatically kind gesture. In return, Maximilian Joseph renounced all his family's claims on the Habsburg inheritance, and this was the crucial part, promised to cast Bavaria's vote for Francis Stephen in the upcoming imperial election. This single death triggered a complete political reset. Cause: the unexpected death of Emperor Charles VII. In January 1745 instantly evaporates the central political justification for the French-led war in Germany, leaving the imperial throne vacant. Effect: Maria Theresa astutely exploits the power vacuum, negotiating the Treaty of Fussen to knock Bavaria out of the war and secure its electoral vote for her husband, Francis Stephen. Consequence: on September 13, 1745, Francis is elected Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. This restores the imperial crown to the Habsburg-Lorraine family, achieving a key Austrian war aim and leaving France and Prussia fighting a conflict that has now lost its original purpose. History is often decided by grand battles and brilliant generals, and sometimes it is decided by a middle-aged guy with a bad case of gout just giving up the ghost. Charles VII's death changed everything. Suddenly, France's whole "we're here to support the rightful emperor" argument looked completely ridiculous. They were now just a foreign army trespassing in Germany with no legal leg to stand on. With one convenient death, Maria Theresa had won a stunning political victory that years of brutal fighting could not secure. With her husband now officially Emperor Francis I, and with Bavaria out of the fight, the war in Germany became increasingly absurd. Frederick was no longer defending German liberties from a Habsburg usurper, because the Habsburgs were now legitimately back on the imperial throne. The conflict was stripped of all its fancy justifications. It was now reduced to its raw, naked essence, a grudge match between France and Britain in the West, and a bitter, bloody fight over a single province between Prussia and Austria in the East. The end of this chapter of the war was finally in sight. By the end of 1745, the war in Germany had reached a point of grim clarity. Frederick the Great, through his string of stunning victories, had proven beyond all doubt that he cannot be militarily evicted from Silesia. He had smashed every army Maria Theresa had thrown at him. He was now occupying her allies' capital, Dresden, and dictating terms. But victory was expensive. The Prussian treasury, once overflowing, was now dangerously low. The campaigns of 1744 and 1745 had been a horrific drain on his kingdom's manpower and money. Frederick had the province he wanted. Now he just wanted the fighting to stop. Maria Theresa, on the other hand, was militarily beaten but politically unbowed. Her husband was now the Holy Roman Emperor, a massive political win, and her hatred for Frederick burned hotter than ever in her heart. She was ready to fight to the last man to reclaim Silesia, but she couldn't afford to. Her armies were funded almost entirely by British subsidies, and her British allies had a massive problem of their own. With Bonnie Prince Charlie and his Highlanders running rampant through Scotland and England, the British government needed the German front of the war to end, and they needed it to end now. They required Austria to stop wasting resources fighting Prussia and focus every available soldier on the main event, fighting France. The British diplomats delivered a cold, hard ultimatum to their Austrian ally. The message was the soul of simplicity: make peace with Frederick now and formally give him Silesia, or the subsidy stop. The flow of British gold would be turned off. It was financial blackmail. Pooh. Ray and simple. Faced with an unbeatable Prussian army on one side, and a paymaster holding a gun to her head on the other, Maria Theresa finally broke. Weeping with rage and frustration, she agreed to negotiate. On Christmas Day, 1745, in the occupied city of Dresden, the peace treaty was signed. The end of the German war was a direct result of these converging pressures. Cause: Frederick's decisive military victories in 1745 proved that retaking Silesia is impossible, while Britain's domestic crisis with the Jacobite rebellion makes them desperate to simplify the Continental War. Effect: the British government forces Maria Theresa's hand with a brutal financial ultimatum. threatening to cut off the subsidies that fund her entire war effort, unless she makes peace with Prussia. Consequence: the Treaty of Dresden is signed, officially ending the Second Silesian War. Austria permanently cedes Silesia to Prussia. In return, Frederick exits the War of the Austrian Succession for good, abandoning his French allies for the second time. And for the second time in this conflict, Frederick the Great just leaves. He smashes up the place, gets the one thing he wanted, and then casually walks out the door while the building is still on fire, whistling a tune from one of his flute concertos. He left his French allies high and dry, again, without a shred of remorse. To Frederick, an alliance was like a bus ticket. You use it to get where you're going, and then you throw it away. Maria Theresa had to give up her favorite province, and all she got in return was Frederick's signature on a piece of paper, which she knew by now was worth absolutely nothing. The treaty's terms were stark. Maria Theresa surrendered all of Silesia to the King of Prussia, forever. In exchange, Frederick recognized her husband as Emperor Francis I, a gesture that cost him nothing, as the election was already over. He then packed up his army, marched out of Saxony, and went home. The war between Prussia and Austria was over, but the War of the Austrian Succession raged on. Frederick had started the blaze, and now he was content to sit on his stolen property and watch the rest of the world burn. France, Spain, Britain, and Austria were still locked in a death grip, with bloody fighting still to come in Italy, the Netherlands, and on the high seas. Frederick had gotten everything he wanted. Everyone else was left to pay the bill. With Frederick the Great's final, dramatic exit, the war in Germany was over. This created a rather awkward situation for everyone else. The entire conflict had started for two reasons. First, to decide if Maria Theresa could inherit her father's lands, and second, for Frederick to steal Silesia. Well, by 1746, Maria Theresa's inheritance was secure. Her husband was the Holy Roman Emperor, and Silesia was officially, legally, and permanently Prussian. The original exam questions had been answered, and yet, the war raged on. The conflict was now running on pure, uncut national rivalry. The original title, The War of the Austrian Succession, was now totally obsolete. It was just a good old-fashioned brawl between the House of Bourbon France and Spain, and the alliance of Great Britain and Austria, mostly out of habit. It was a war without a point. A series of bloody campaigns fought for minor territorial advantages that might look good at the eventual peace conference. The main event was now in the Austrian Netherlands. Here, the French were utterly dominant, with Prussia out of the fight and the British distracted and weakened by the Jacobite rebellion. The brilliant Marshal Saxe had a free hand, and he used it to conduct a masterclass in 18th century warfare. He began a methodical, relentless conquest of the entire region. In early 1746, he captured the capital, Brussels. Later that year, he met the cobbled-together Allied army at the Battle of Raku and beat them soundly. The next year, 1747, he did it again. He invaded the Dutch Republic itself, which was supposed to be a neutral party, causing a political crisis that swept the old government from power. He then met the Allied army again at the Battle of Lauffeld and once again defeated them. His campaign culminated in the Siege of Bergen-op-Zoom, a fortress so famously well-designed it was considered impregnable. Saxe engineers and soldiers took it by storm, a feat that sent a shiver of shock and awe through every court in Europe. While the French were winning everything in the north, the Italian front was a chaotic, bloody seize-all. This was the Bourbons' other project, a joint Franco-Spanish effort to carve a kingdom out of Austria and Italy for the Spanish Queen's younger son. The fighting here was messy and indecisive. In 1745, the Bourbons won a big victory and occupied Milan, but in 1746, Austria, now able to send troops south after making peace with Prussia, came roaring back. They crushed the Franco-Spanish army, kicked them out of northern Italy, and even briefly invaded the south of France. The front then settled into a brutal and expensive stalemate in the Alps. The war had lost its plot, devolving into a grinding, pointless slugfest, caused with Prussia's exit. The war's original German objectives ceased to exist, but the deep-seated global rivalry between the Bourbon powers and the Anglo-Austrian alliance remains unresolved. Effect, the military focus shifts entirely to the secondary theaters in the Netherlands and Italy, where the fighting becomes an attritional struggle for leverage, devoid of any grand strategic purpose. Consequence, although the French army under Marshal Saxe achieves a string of spectacular victories, conquering the Austrian Netherlands, the immense financial drain of these campaigns bankrupts the French state, proving that tactical success doesn't always lead to strategic victory. At this point, The War of the Austrian Succession is like a bar fight that has spilled out into the street and is still going 3 hours after everyone forgot who threw the first punch. The original argument is over, but nobody wants to be the first to stop swinging. France is winning round after round in the Netherlands, but every victory costs them a mountain of cash they don't have. They're like a boxer winning on points, but also slowly bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts. It's a glorious, pointless, and ridiculously expensive mess. Everyone was getting tired. France was winning battles, but going broke. Britain was getting humiliated on land. Austria had survived, but was exhausted and still bitter about Silesia. The war was staggering towards a conclusion, based not on a decisive victory, but on mutual, crippling exhaustion. But before the diplomats could finally sit down, the fight had to play out in its final, sprawling arena, the oceans and colonies of the wider world. The powdered wig slugfest in Europe was only half the story for the two great global rivals. Britain and France, the battles in Flanders and Italy were almost a sideshow. The real prize, the long-term game, was for the future of the entire planet. The war provided the perfect excuse for their simmering colonial and commercial rivalries to boil over into open conflict in the Americas, the Caribbean, and India. This wasn't a war for a German province, it was a war for empire in North America. The conflict was known as King George's War. It was the third in a series of brutal proxy wars fought between British and French colonists, each side backed by their respective Native American allies. The fighting wasn't about grand, sweeping battles like Fontenoy. It was a vicious, grinding affair of frontier raids, ambushes, and brutal skirmishes along the border between New England and New France. The single greatest event of this war, however, was an undertaking so audacious it bordered on insane. The French had built a fortress on Cape Breton Island at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. It was called Louisbourg. It was a massive, modern, stone bastion fortress, the most expensive overseas fortification ever built by a European power. It was known as the Gibraltar of the North, and it was considered absolutely impregnable. It guarded the maritime highway into French Canada and served as a base for French privateers to savage New England as fishing fleets. In 1745, the colonists of Massachusetts decided they'd had enough in a move that military professionals in Europe scoffed at. They organized their own invasion. This wasn't the British Army, it was a 4,000-man militia of farmers, merchants, and fishermen, led by a lumber merchant named William Pepperell. This amateur army, backed by a Royal Navy squadron that blockaded the port, landed near Louisbourg and began a siege. What they lacked in professional training, they made up for with sheer, stubborn ingenuity. They dragged cannons through impassable marshes, set up their batteries, and began pounding the great fortress, to the absolute shock of the French garrison and the entire world. After 46 days, Louisbourg surrendered. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the same script was playing out with the roles reversed. In India, the war was fought not by states, but by two massive corporations, the British East India Company and its French rival, the Compagnie des Indes Orientales. The French effort was led by the brilliant and ambitious governor, Joseph-François Dupleix, who dreamed of driving the British out and establishing a French empire in India. In 1-7-46, a French naval squadron arrived, and they did their own version of the Louisbourg siege. They attacked and captured the main British trading post of Madras. It was a stunning blow, the biggest victory the French would win against the British outside of Europe. The colonial fronts mirrored each other perfectly. Cause, the formal declaration of war between Britain and France in Europe, unleashes decades of pent-up colonial rivalry, giving their colonists and trading companies a green light to attack each other's territories and assets across the globe. Effect, a stunning amateur victory by New England colonists results in the capture of the impregnable French fortress of Louisbourg in North America, while a professional French naval expedition results in the capture of the vital British port of Madras in India. Consequence, these major colonial victories, which were won with local blood and treasure, are viewed by the European powers as little more than bargaining chips. The captured territories become assets to be traded away in the final peace treaty, creating immense bitterness and resentment among the colonists who saw them as existential triumphs. This is where you see the real, long-term stakes of the war. While the European nobles were fighting over who got to own a castle in Belgium, colonists and company men were fighting over the future of entire continents. A bunch of Massachusetts fishermen and farmers managed to capture France's super fortress in Canada, which was like a local pub's dart team winning the World Cup. It was a massive achievement, but as they'd soon find out, when the grown-ups in Europe sit down to negotiate, Colonial victories are the first thing they're willing to trade away. By 1748, the world was at a stalemate. France was the undisputed master of the European continent. Britain was the undisputed master of the seas. France held Madras. Britain held Louisbourg. Every nation involved was groaning under a mountain of debt. The soldiers were exhausted. The taxpayers were broke. The politicians had run out of excuses. The fighting sputtered to a halt. Not because anyone had won, but because everyone had lost the ability to keep paying for it. It was time to talk. By 1748, the tank was empty. Every kingdom, empire, and republic that had cheerfully jumped into the war 8 years earlier was now staring at the bottom of its treasury. The fight sputtered out not with a climactic bang, but with a collective, exhausted whimper. The diplomats were summoned to the neutral German city of Aix-la-Chapelle to sweep up the mess. There was no grand victory to celebrate. The mood was that of a drawn-out, ruinously expensive lawsuit that both parties had agreed to settle out of court, just to make the legal bill stop. The main negotiations were driven by Britain and France, the two global heavyweights. Their allies, Austria and Spain, were largely ignored and presented with a finished deal to sign. The guiding principle of the entire treaty was a concept beloved by weary diplomats: status quo ante bellum, a return to the way things were before the war. It was a continent-sized reset button. The great trade-off was stunning in its symmetry. France, which had spent years and a fortune conquering the entire Austrian Netherlands under the brilliant Marshal Saxe, agreed to give it all back. Every last city and fortress. The French public, who had celebrated these great victories, was horrified. In exchange, Great Britain agreed to give back the prize jewel of its colonial war. The great fortress of Louisbourg. The New England colonists who had bled for it were apoplectic. Madras was returned to the British in India. In Italy, the Spanish queen's son was given a couple of small duchies, a consolation prize. The treaty also formally recognized Maria Theresa's right to rule and her husband's title as emperor. And then there was the elephant in the room. The one, giant, glaring exception to the Grand Reset. The treaty formally confirmed, once and for all, that the province of Silesia belonged to Prussia. The peace was a product of pure, mutual exhaustion. Cause, after 8 years of devastating and financially crippling warfare across multiple continents, all belligerents recognized that a decisive victory is unattainable. Effect, the dominant powers, Britain and France, broker the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which is built on the principle of returning all major conquests to their pre-war owners. Consequence, the treaty resolves none of the core rivalries. It enrages the French public and American colonists, and most importantly, it formalizes the loss of Silesia, leaving Austria deeply embittered. This peace is nothing more than an armistice, guaranteeing a future, even larger conflict. So after 8 years of war, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and enough debt to sink a small continent, what changed? Almost nothing. It's the geopolitical equivalent of a giant 8-season-long TV show that ends with a screen saying, "And then they all went home." The status quo is God. France gave back a whole country. Britain gave back a super fortress. The only person who actually came out ahead was Frederick the Great, the guy who started the whole mess. He cashed in his stolen chips and walked away from the table, leaving everyone else with a pile of IOUs and a massive grudge. No one was happy. The French coined a phrase, "Bade comme la paix, as stupid as the peace." The American colonists learned a bitter lesson about the value of their sacrifices. In the eyes of European diplomats, a lesson that would fester for another 30 years. But the most furious person of all was Maria Theresa. She was forced to sign away her beloved province. But she never forgave and she never forgot. The ink on the treaty was barely dry before she began the great work of reforming her military and her diplomatic alliances, all with one goal in mind, the inevitable rematch. The war was over, but the peace wouldn't last. And that's how a dodgy mushroom dinner led to 8 years of global chaos that ended, more or less, right back where it started, but with more graves and bigger bills. In the end, Prussia's audacious smash and grab paid off, proving that sometimes in history, crime really does pay, as long as you have a terrifyingly good infantry. Please, for the love of all that is historically accurate, do not use this podcast as study material for your exams. Your teachers will cry. But hopefully, you had a bit more fun than they would have allowed. What other historical train wrecks should we simplify next? Let us know in the comments below. Was it the time Sweden got into a 30-year-long argument? Or the time a bunch of Dutchmen went broke buying tulip bulbs? Your call. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.